Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. You guessed it, y'all. Today we are going to talk about The Boys Season 2, Episode 4. I am all about this show, y'all. I don't know if you could tell, considering how many episodes I have done on this so far, but yeah. I'm pretty into the show, and I am excited for you guys to come along for the ride with me. I've always wanted to see what it would really look like if we had superheroes, because a lot of the time it's in cartoons and stuff, and it's fluffed a little bit to make it seem more palatable for children, and more palatable for the adults that are governing what they get to watch. But superheroes are for everyone, and I firmly stand by that. I don't think that we need to just give up the things that we love once we exit childhood and enter adulthood. That is an arbitrary timeline anyway, and who's to say that superheroes are just for kids? This show definitely illustrates that this is not for kids. This is for adults too. And that's one of the things that I love about Deadpool, and one of the things that I love about The Boys. Neither of them really pretend to be anything other than what they are. These are full-on TVMA or R-rated superhero programming. Or rather, just soup programming. Supervillain, anti-hero, you decide. But my point is that it just is what it is. There is no dumbing down of the violence. You drive a boat through a whale, there's going to be some trauma there. And now I don't know if it's going to really explode the whale like that. I would imagine that whales get rammed quite a bit at high speeds when, they're fighting sharks and stuff. But I digress. It's gory. Some of it is just gory for the sake of being gory, but I am here for it. It's kind of like that anime Elfen Lied, where they are like, yeah, if this thing happened, it would be incredibly gory. And it's off-putting to some people, but if you're still sticking around and watching these episodes with me, you're not one of them. So come on board with me as we talk about Season 2, Episode 4 of The Boys. Now, we're going to talk about Homelander's interesting escapades with Doppelganger. We're also going to talk about Carl Urban's character, Billy Butcher, and his relationship with Rebecca and the crossroads they find themselves at. And we're also going to talk about relationships between Huey and Annie, and Frenchie and Kimiko, and Maeve and Elena. This episode is mainly about fleshing out a lot of the characters and their interactions, particularly in the relationship realm. We're also going to talk about Stormfront really coming to a head with Homelander. So we have 3 main story arcs really in this episode. We have Billy still trying to rescue his wife Becca, and not really mentioning the kid at all in true Billy style. We also have Homelander really trying to find his footing in the 7 with the introduction of this new person, Stormfront. Homelander was not prepared for that. He thought that killing Madeline Stillwell would give him more power, when really it looks like he's garnered a lot less. Mr. Edgar in particular seems to be putting Stormfront at the front of the Seven, at least in all of the media circuits. Anywhere Mr. Edgar seems to be in the media, there Stormfront also appears to be. So that is very interesting as the events continue to unfold. How much does Mr. Edgar know about Stormfront, and how much of it is she in on? Inversely. So they're looking at those two things in this episode, and then they are also on the hunt for someone named Liberty. So we get a road trip. I do love road trips, you guys, IRL and in movies. So overall, it's an emotional episode, and in true The Boys nature, it is a roller coaster. So first up, Billy and Grace have a meeting. And Grace has been fed up with Billy for quite a long time because she deems him as partially or primarily responsible for the deaths of her grandchildren at the hands of Lamplighter. So she's not pleased to see him, but once she's found out that Becca is still alive, she is wanting to help Billy find his wife, because part of the reason that Grace has pushed Billy away so much is her own pain, but also the fact that she is the one who got Billy into this to begin with. So, she has a lot of guilt going on, and she wants to absolve some of that by helping Billy out. At least, as far as I can tell. You can never know someone's true intentions in this show. But Billy and Grace meet again, and there was this soup years and years ago, like 50 years ago, that was on Susan Rayner's server before she was murdered. So Susan was onto something and was trying to tell the boys that right before she was killed. So Grace is helping him track this information down. But Billy isn't going to be the one to go and find Liberty and figure out whatever this connection is, because Grace gives him details about Becca and Ryan's location. So, of course, Billy is going to choose Becca over anything. So Billy ends up sending Mother's Milk to go find Liberty, while Billy looks for his wife. So MM decides to bring Huey along for that road trip, and somehow Annie gets involved too. So it's pretty understandable how Annie gets involved. Annie is really freaked out by Homelander right now and everything that's been going on, and decides to just leave for a while and road trip. After all, Queen Maeve did it, and no one seemed to notice. A lot of the soups seem to do just whatever they want. At least Translucent set that precedent in season 1 when he was missing for a while, and they're like, oh yeah, he's just probably off doing God knows what. That's just so Translucent to just disappear for days at a time. And they didn't really start worrying about him until it had been a while. So perhaps this is something that's reasonable, or perhaps Homelander is still keeping tabs on everyone. Remember, he can fly, and he appears to be super fast in that aspect, so he could really be anywhere just watching you with his X-ray vision. What kind of vision is it? Because he can't see through zinc, but you get what I'm saying. He can see through most things, and, is probably hovering above you at any point, waiting to laser you. So, anyway, I don't know if that holds up, but Annie seems to think that she'll be safe on this road trip away from the prying eyes of Homelander and all of these cameras, as long as she wears a hat. So she does. And they go on a road trip. But at the same time as MM and Annie and Huey are starting off on this trip to find out more about Liberty and what she had to do with Susan Rayner's death, we also have Billy going to look for Becca, and Homelander is visiting Madeline Stillwell. So that's a little bit confusing, seeing as he lasered her to death in the end of season 1. Stared into her eyes and just lasered her straight through her skull. It looked like it melted the bone almost. It really looked like he went straight through her. So, now he is kind of seeing Madeline, and you're like, is this some kind of weird fantasy? Is this a memory? What is going on? But it's really kind of uncanny valley. Something is just entirely off. And Madeline is carrying her own breast milk around and wearing like this fantasy outfit. And it turns out that Homelander is taking on the form of Madeline to please Homelander in a sexual manner. It's very strange, but also makes a lot of sense. So we've seen things like this before as it relates to the Supes and the underground club that Ezekiel was a part of, and how a lot of times it just turns into absolute debauchery. They get very inventive with their debauchery, and this really isn't that different. They play Mystique in X-Men a lot of times for sexualized roles and sexualized undercover ops. But this is their downtime. This is Doppelganger's downtime, I guess. But he is doing this for Homelander because he's scared of Homelander, really. So the whole thing smacks of coercion and somewhat sexual assault. Actually, I don't know how much of this Doppelganger is doing out of fear and how much of it is him fawning over Homelander because it's Homelander. A lot of them seem to have some kind of hero worship for him if they aren't in his immediate circle within the 7. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but we do know that Homelander either trusts Doppelganger enough to not spill his secret, or he knows that Doppelganger is scared enough of him to not spill this secret that Doppelganger is taking on the form of Stillwell for sexual escapades. It comes off as pretty creepy, but, no kink shaming, to each their own, as long as it's all consensual. That's the part that really creeps me out the most in this aspect. So like with Gecko is letting people pay him to chop off appendages because they grow back. Does it hurt him? Maybe, but he doesn't seem to really scream out in pain. I don't know if he's desensitized to it or what, but he seems to be the one initiating these fully consensual acts, and he is getting paid for them. So there is that. He seems to be fully in on it. There is no coercion involved. However, on the Homelander side of things, everyone seems to be afraid of him for at least a little bit, if they know him at all. Becca is afraid of him for obvious reasons. Madeline knew exactly what he was capable of, and so her fear for him grew. And the more she feared him, the more she fawned over him. She can't fight him, and she can't flee from him, so she chose that third response we've talked about in the past, which is fawning. So how much of this is fawning, how much of it is fear on the part of Doppelganger, I'm not really sure. But either way, it definitely makes you very uncomfortable when you're watching it. Something seems off. And for me, I think that boils down to the consent issue. Something about Homelander's interactions with most people don't seem to be entirely consensual. The only person so far who has really seemed to be able to put him in his place is Mr. Edgar. And we know that Homelander has mommy issues, as is very evident with Stillwell, but perhaps he also has some daddy issues, and he might be finding that father figure in Mr. Edgar. Mr. Edgar is the only one who can back him down when he is being just full-out Homelander, And he's also able to just put him in his place without doing anything more than having that quiet tone that Giancarlo Esposito is fantastic at, and reminds me a bit of Captain Janeway from Star Trek Voyager. When Janeway gets quiet, that's when her tone gets the most threatening, and it feels the same way with Giancarlo Esposito. He's not prone to fits of rage with a lot of his characters, and he doesn't have to. When he plays these characters, especially the types like Mr. Edgar, if he gets quiet, it's because he's calculating and he's not letting his emotions get the best of him. Whereas that's exactly what happens to Homelander. He reacts strongly from his emotions. Does he regret killing Madeline? I don't think so. But he does regret, I think, that loss of the mother figure and the sexualization of her, that relationship that he had with Madeline. So I don't think that he really feels bad about killing her, but he's like, oh, dang it, now I miss this thing that I had. So it's more of a possession for him rather than a person. And that also carries over some creepy connotations into these interactions with Doppelganger. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the road trip and what Annie and Huey and MM find out about Liberty. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Homelander's interesting interactions with Doppelganger, who he's having take the form of Madeline Stillwell, and we're also talking about all of the different relationships that we are exploring in this episode. This episode is largely about relationships. The first few episodes of this season have mostly been about establishing the plot lines for the season, tying up loose ends from the last one, and have been very heavy on the action. This episode slows down a bit, and it's about 68 minutes long, so that's a little bit long for traditional TV, but you guys, we are in the era of binge-watching television, even if we have to wait a week each time for these new episodes to come out on Amazon Prime. But you get my drift. Without these commercials and stuff, we get to have a lot more time with our characters. We're not having to set this within the parameters of making sure it ends so that the next show can come on. It's the difference between going to a music festival like ACL, where they have those really tight timelines and it's super efficient and well orchestrated and everyone is on and off at these predetermined times, versus going to see your favorite musician at a show that's just them and maybe an opener or two. You know that you don't have to have it over at a specific time and there may be multiple encores. So it's kind of like that. So we don't have to worry about what comes on after The Boys on Amazon Prime, so it can be super long, and honestly, I enjoyed it. I know a lot of people complained that this episode was really long at 68 minutes long. People were like, oh, it's almost like movie length, but you know what? why does that have to be a bad thing? Especially when we only get 8 episodes this season. I also like that it slowed down a bit to get us some more information about how all these characters are interacting with each other now that so much has changed between them. We don't entirely know how long there was between Billy being disappeared and the boys, hanging out with pretty much Huey as their head. We don't know how long Huey and Annie were really separated either. Could have been days, could have been weeks, could be months. Who knows? They seem pretty ticked off that it had taken Billy so much time to come back to them. So, I'm not entirely sure. But I like that we're taking the time to see who they are with each other in season 2. We also haven't had a lot of time between MM and Annie. And so MM is getting to know Annie and vice versa. And we're also seeing these differences between who Huey is in these different contexts, which I really enjoy. And it's allowing MM to also see another side of Huey. And in a world where Annie isn't really safe being vulnerable in a lot of these situations because Homelander is breathing down her neck, it's really nice to see her be able to be comfortable being vulnerable in front of MM too. So it's really about her time with Huey, but she knows that Huey trusts this person and that she can trust him as well. Even if Huey has lied to her a lot in the past, she is able to still trust him in some ways. And I think that this is an illustration of that too. So, also, I kind of forgot there for a little bit that Billy shot Annie last season while she was talking to Huey in order to save Huey from being arrested by Annie. So I can imagine why she would be very uncomfortable with Billy and or anyone who Huey's hanging out with. But I think that Annie's also smart enough to understand the differences between them and why Billy did what he did. Unlike Homelander, Annie can put aside her emotions there for a little bit to understand the motivations of other people and why that matters. She's introspective enough to be able to kind of piece that together, and she has a big enough heart to forgive. Billy's not a super forgiving person, but Annie is, and I think that that really helps with her growth a lot. Annie and Huey are on very similar paths with their heroes' journeys, and we talked about that in the episodes for the podcast we did on season 1 as well. But they're both under a lot of pressure right now, and Huey almost seems like he's crumbling. He is struggling to hold it together without Annie in his life and without Robin in his life before in season 1. Huey seems to not have a lot to live for. He's not really invested in himself. Without having a woman in his life or some kind of mission, he seems to just absolutely crumble into a shell of what he was before. And it's going to take a lot of his own personal growth to get there. Now, we have seen him standing up for himself and for others more recently too, with him standing up to Billy and getting punched in the face for his efforts, but also in trying to make sure that everyone stays safe. He still went back for MM and Frenchie, even though he knew that it would go sideways. So Huey's working on it. He's working on that hero's journey, but it's just taking him a while, and we're seeing him crumple a little bit. But I like that about this show. It's much more believable than in a lot of other superhero stories where you have one of your heroes or anti-heroes really just facing all this adversity and not having any real setbacks. unless it is a physical one, like when Bane breaks Batman's back and things like that. But this is a huge deal for Huey mentally and emotionally. And those are the kind of stories that I really love. Like Batman's A Death in the Family. That death of Jason Todd is more emotionally and mentally impactful for Batman than maybe even Bane breaking his back is. Seeing Tony Stark struggle with PTSD and alcoholism, it makes them more relatable to see that they can also succumb to the same pressures and indignations that the rest of us have to endure. Because underneath all of this soup stuff, they are still humans. Or at the very least, our heroes are all still breathing, feeling creatures. And it's important to keep that in mind. I like that they take it there. I know a lot of folks don't care for the areas in shows where they explore the relationships more, but I really appreciate it. After all, it's not that upsetting for Gwen Stacy to die if Spider-Man isn't fully invested in her, and also thereby making us more invested in her. Now, I'm not condoning fridging female characters or anything like that, but what I am saying is that if we don't understand how much they mean to each other, then there's not going to be that emotional impact when something goes awry. And to illustrate that, think about the scene where Kylo Ren kills Han Solo, and how absolutely gutting that is because of how attached we are to Han, and the fact that Leia feels it and knows. We don't even know Kylo Ren that well yet. We don't know Ben, in fact, at all. But it's still a crazy emotional moment for us. And if they hadn't taken the time to help us get to know Han in different contexts, it wouldn't have felt as impactful. And to illustrate that, think about how you conversely felt when Admiral Holds died. I felt absolutely nothing for that woman because we didn't get to know her enough outside of any capacity other than just straight up as a commander. So even within the Star Wars saga, you have these examples of these two very different experiences with character death. And Holdo's act was supposed to be impactful, no pun intended, but fully embraced. But she doesn't have that same weight because we don't know her. But a very similar scene to the one with Holdo was played out on Stargate over a decade ago to very different effects. When Samantha Carter decided she was going to go down with the ship and ram it into the enemy to save everyone else, it was crushing, even though that was taking place in an alternate reality or an alternate universe, an alternate timeline. I don't remember which alternate that specific one was, but you get my point. It was alternate. It wasn't even our Samantha Carter necessarily, but it was still very upsetting because it was Samantha Carter and we knew who she was as a person. Whereas Admiral Holdo, it didn't matter at all in my opinion, really. It was like, okay, this is cool cinematically, but other than that, Stargate really did it better and long, long ago. So while you may not necessarily love these stories that are really delving more into the relationship than the action, they definitely serve their purpose. They have a definite place in the plot lines of these stories and making sure that these things have emotional impact. We wouldn't really care about how Batman was reacting about Jason Todd if he had just been introduced 5 minutes ago and we never got to see them in the same room. So these extended scenes of going on this road trip together and chatting in the car and just general socializing, I love it because it is important for fleshing out these characters and who they are to each other. It's putting MM in the same room as Annie, but also within a different context than his relationship with Huey, and just seeing how they all interact differently within this context. It's kind of like taking your new partner home to meet your family or your friends. And you get a little bit nervous, but maybe also a little bit excited about that because you're going to see how they act in these different contexts. I feel a very similar way about seeing that happen with these characters. So I think it's great. I went off on a tangent on that one for a little bit, mostly because people seem to be so bothered by it, I guess. They were complaining about it a lot on the internet, and for me, I felt that I would be remiss to not rebut it. We do get a lot of scenes with that, but they have this drive across America's heartland to go and find someone who is connected to Liberty. They can't find Liberty herself, but they find someone who is connected to her. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what they found and what that means for the future of the boys. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Before the break, we were talking about the storyline of Huey, and Annie driving across the country, and how a lot of folks felt that these scenes really dragged out. But I think that they are imperative to preparing us for emotional impacts. Now, I'm not saying that something is necessarily specifically going to go wrong. I can't read the future, see the future. But I am saying that they are laying some excellent groundwork for something to hit us sideways and get us right in the feels in case it does happen in the future. You may not watch Grey's Anatomy, or maybe you are like me and you do, but it's very similar to how they lay a lot of groundwork in the mid-seasons so that you're prepared for understanding a world in which these characters would be distraught when things go awry. But now I want to talk about what they actually find out. It's nice to see Huey and Annie getting to be a little bit more lighthearted and more comfortable with each other again, but ultimately the most important part of this grinds that to a halt. So Huey, and Annie arrive at the house of someone who is connected to Liberty. Someone who was in Susan Rayner's computer records that Grace Mallory found and delivered to Billy. So they arrive at this lady's home, and she is not very comfortable talking about this, and it's a very similar reaction that we've seen in other people who have been coerced or blackmailed or bought out with their NDA of, silence by Vought. So it's something that we're growing accustomed to, and you can recognize it now when you see it. But they convince her to go ahead and tell them anyway. So this lady tells them that about 50 years ago, she actually saw Liberty, who was a soup in a cop-like role before they had the soups up to like the Vought 7, and that she saw Liberty murder her brother, and that she called him a racial slur before she did it. And there was absolutely no reason for her to have any physical contact with this man. She pulls him over under a pretense and then proceeds to get him out and kills him, just for no other reason than she is racist. And she felt like it, and she knew that she could get away with it because she has that authority behind her of being in a police capacity. This is very similar to what we see happening in the US today. And it has been happening for over 50 years in this specific capacity. And this lady who is interviewed on the show, she says that she was paid to stay quiet and that Liberty is the same soup that we know as Stormfront. Now, we know that soups are made, not born, and we also know that, they have a lot of healing abilities and stuff like that, but we're still, at least as far as I can tell, in the early stages of soups. So it's not quite clear yet how they age, but Liberty looks the same as Stormfront, like as though she stepped from one day into the next. And we've seen her interactions with Kenji and Kimiko. She is still just as racist and murderous as she was 50 years ago. As a symbol, racism is just as prominent today as it was back then. And now it just looks different. Racism manages to keep with the times, like Madonna, just reinventing itself in different guises as it continues. And I think it's also very telling that her name was Liberty back then. That is just a symbol of Americanism, and that's how America was. That's how it is. We haven't really come all that far along from the Jim Crow laws. So Liberty / Stormfront is the symbol of the immortal, dangerous, and aggressive nature of racism. It's a persistent evil, just like Liberty / Stormfront. And Stormfront also isn't interested in maintaining any appearances of the status quo. She knows that she can't wear her racism on her sleeve because that would result in her immediate removal of her authority or her position of authority as Stormfront right now because there is so much media involvement. But she's also cultivating this image of not being part of the group, of not being a part of the system, really. Liberty is anti-system. She's beyond the system, but she's still going to be working at the top of the system. But she's not worried about being politically correct or liked. Things just are what they are as far as Stormfront is concerned. And that is appealing to a lot of folks in the masses. So someone who isn't wanting to worry about keeping up this particular image that they're supposed to convey of being part of this company or organization or country that is known for, being kind and patriotic and things like that. The things that Starlight and Homelander symbolize to the rest of the country as the faces of Vought. Instead, Stormfront is just going, hey, a lot of these people are being phony. I'm fed up with the phoniness, and I'm just going to be me. And that can be really appealing Don't we all want to feel that liberated to just be our full, complete selves and be secure in the fact that it doesn't really matter how people react one way or the other, that we are who we are unapologetically? I think that that's largely a lot of the appeal with Stormfront. And if you see where I'm going with this, largely a lot of the appeal that people see in candidates like Donald Trump. There is a very strong correlation between those two characters, or between Donald Trump and Stormfront. Although Stormfront is actually very coherent in her speeches and seems to be cogent, the correlation remains. Stormfront is a very strong symbol of Donald Trump, or she may be viewed that way, and the direction that the current socio-political climate is heading. She's an embodiment, a representation of that. This episode has a lot of correlations to the current issues we're seeing in sociopolitics in the U.S. right now, with the military-industrial complex, the Americanization of political offices or authority figures as being celebrities, and vice versa. After all, becoming one of the seven seems to almost be like an American Idol audition process. I think there's also a really strong representation in Liberty becoming Stormfront and still being just as racist and murderous as she was before. Like, racism hasn't changed that much in 50 years, really. It's just changed outfits. And it reminds me in many ways of season 3 of American Horror Story, Coven. So in that season, they literally have an immortal, murderous racist as a blatant example of that. But they also talk about it as witches versus humans. It's allegorical in that manner. But we have that character, Delphine, who is very similar in some ways to Stormfront/Liberty. And we also see that embodied with the boardroom scene between the witch hunters, the supreme of the witches, and the voodoo queen character. It's another example of how racism has largely moved from being just overt aggression committed by random strangers and more towards organized boardroom decisions. They're both about the Americanization of politics and business. It's about capitalism, and both the boys and that season of American Horror Story reflect that racism just really changes faces. It changes methods, but it is still omnipresent. Although to people outside of that experience, they may not recognize it when they see it because they have not necessarily seen it before in their own personal experience. You're not going to recognize a witch hunter when you see one unless you yourself have experience with them, and the only way that you would have that is if you were also a witch. Now, if you haven't seen that season, to be clear, witches are noted in a positive connotation, kind of like how they are in the Vampire Diaries, and are used as an allegory for otherness, and one of those components is race. So in that way, both storylines from American Horror Story and The Boys can be viewed as allegories for racism, as well as white privilege and the current socio-political climate we find ourselves in. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to catch up with Billy and Becca, and then figure out what's going on with Homelander. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Stormfront as an allegory for Donald Trump, for the history of racism in America within the last 50 to 60 years, and what that has to do with the American Horror Story Season 3 plotline, Coven. Now we're going to catch up with Billy and Becca, and then wrap up this episode with Homelander. Remember that while Annie and MM and Huey have been on this road trip to find out more about this person named Liberty who was in Susan Rayner's file, Billy has been on a mission to find Becca. Remember, Grace Mallory gave him the information about Liberty at the same time she gave him the information on Becca. So, of course, Billy delegates Liberty and the safety of all mankind to someone else, and he goes to find his wife, his only real priority. Billy probably wouldn't care if the world was literally burning down around him, so long as he has Becca. It's been figuratively burning around him for a decade, and he had absolutely lost his will to live when he finally came to terms with the fact that his wife was most likely dead. Becca is Billy's everything, and that may or may not be a great thing for Billy or for Becca. After all, Homelander does also kind of hate Billy, so he very well could take out anything that Billy does on Becca, just like Billy tried to do with Homelander and Stillwell, but Billy was looking at it through his eyes. He thought that maybe Homelander loved Stillwell and venerated her and really would have done anything to keep her alive, because that's how Billy feels about Becca. But it's outside of Homelander's experience to have that sort of unconditional love. So that may have been Billy projecting a little bit, to be honest. And also underestimating how out there Homelander really is. So Billy's very excited to go and find Becca. Really excited is less the word, but more determined. And he finds a way to reach out to her and go talk to her. And when she does hear from him and decides to meet him, she's able to, just signal to the cameras that are everywhere around her house that she's going to go for a drive to smoke. So she holds up the cigarettes and the lighter and heads out. But instead, she goes to a bridge, a covered bridge area, and catches up with Billy. So these scenes are just so sweet, and Carl Urban's amazing. I love him as an actor. I love him in so many different movies and TV shows, but he also does a great job coming across as vulnerable and just so in love with his wife. And after Billy has been so angry and hard and murderous for so long, it's really nice to see him finally get to be back with Rebecca and see how he interacts with Becca in this totally different context and the side of him that he won't show to anyone but her. So they have some time together. They're able to reunite strongly, and then Billy and Becca talk about running away. And Becca is like, hey, I can't do that without my kid. I can't do that without Ryan. And of course, Billy has only mentioned Becca the entire time. And he's like, well, it's fine. Just bring him along or whatever. He can stay here. And Billy's just viewing him as being an NPC in his life. He is the child of Homelander because he was conceived when Homelander raped Becca. So that is already a terrible and startling reminder for Billy. But also the child is a soup, and Billy doesn't really care for or trust any of them, even if he does hang out with Kimiko and her being a part of the boys. It's kind of similar with how Jack O'Neill is with the Gold, including the Tok'ra, except for, of course, the matter of Selmac, or Jacob Carter. But he also really likes and respects Jacob, so he knows him pretty well. Billy doesn't necessarily like Kimiko, and I don't know if I would go so far as to say Billy really respects anybody, but Billy has seen her put the greater good above her personal interests, which is not something that Billy has even been able to do. So I think that he has somewhat of an understanding of her character, where he doesn't necessarily trust her fully, but he trusts her about as much as Billy can really bring himself to trust anybody, given how untrustworthy and unreliable Billy is in and of himself. So the one thing that does really get me a little bit is that Billy would definitely not have been stoked to see the kid, to have Ryan be a part of that, but he knows Becca. At least he knew who she was 9-10 years ago. But he seems to be kind of surprised that she's really wanting to bring the kid with her, as though she hasn't spent 9 years with this person. Now, I get that for Billy, Becca is his one and only. That is his person. She is the only person he would be willing to be vulnerable around and everything else. But I don't quite see how Billy wouldn't have had any other plan beyond just telling Becca to leave the kid, or lying to her that he would just deal with it and the kid could come along, and Becca going, no, I know you would try to get rid of him as soon as humanly possible. Which also seems pretty dark, that Becca is saying that Billy would just go ahead and try to ditch the kid ASAP. Granted, Billy was never a huge fan of soups, but for a while, Becca did work at Vought, and he'd been to some parties with the soups. Before she was raped by Homelander and Billy thought that she was perhaps dead, or just missing, and he was looking for her for years, it didn't really seem all that much like Billy outright hated soups, to the point that he would try to ditch a child. Is it because he just hates children that much? I don't exactly know what is happening there, that Becca goes, no, I know you would try to ditch him ASAP. Who is this person that would just try to ditch an actual child? Why does Becca feel that way about Billy? Does she just totally know him in all of his darkness and accept him for who and what he is, just totally and completely? That feels a little bit foreign, I suppose, to me, that she would know that about him and still want to be with someone who would just upright ditch a child, given how connected she is to Ryan and how she feels about kids. It just seems very diametrically opposed to me. That's just to me. So that seems a little bit strange. Billy's very smart, and I feel like he would have at least had some other type of plan going into that. It's hard to imagine that, although he does have tunnel vision when it comes to Becca, that he would be so single-minded in just getting to her and getting her to leave, that he would not even take into account the variable of how she may or may not feel about her child. That's just wacky to me. Then again, Becca did choose to keep the baby and to go under this surveillance program by Vought instead. Now, that just seems super, I don't know, it's interesting and strange. Maybe he just really hates kids. He didn't seem to hate the baby, though, that he used the laser eyes with when they first found out that soups were made and not born, though. He, after all, left the little guy there and said that he'd better walk the straight and narrow or Billy would be back to kill him, essentially, as he got older. So I thought that we'd kind of set this boundary that Billy has some sense of morality here and is not into harming children. But then again, he did use that baby as a weapon, so I don't know. I don't know where we're at this point, but we do know that children or something was important enough to Becca to leave Billy, and that she stayed with Ryan this entire time too. If they're more interested in Ryan than in Becca, Becca ostensibly could have left at absolutely any point over the years if she was able to get over the wall or whatever. But instead it appears that she stayed and she cares about the kid. Now I don't know if that means she always cared about him or what. I can't imagine the trauma of carrying your rapist baby for 9 months, or I'm assuming they have about the same incubation time as regular human children, non-soup human children. That seems very incredibly traumatic. But Becca decided to do that for some reason. I don't know if they threatened Billy or if it was some form of coercion or what, but she seems like she could probably leave and she would be fine. Maybe they would track somebody down to kill her, but maybe as long as she kept her mouth shut, they wouldn't care that much. But she doesn't really seem to care to escape, and she only goes and threatens to leave and take Ryan with her when Homelander does actually show up. But I guess that that's just something that Billy is going to have to work through. He also really hasn't had face-to-face time with the boy yet. He only briefly saw Ryan when Homelander took him over to show that Becca was alive. And that's all that Billy really knows, to be honest. I'm excited to see a potential point in the future where Billy gets introduced to Ryan. I really like Ryan as a character so far, and the fact that he is pushing away Homelander and is not as afraid of him as other people necessarily are, or at least not in the same way that other people are. He has a unique relationship with him. So I'm excited to see how that goes in the future. Hopefully we'll get to see that soon. I don't know if we're going to get to see it by the end of season 2, but also given that it's such a short season, even if the episodes are really long, it may be better that we don't get to see it until season 3, and we can just keep this lengthened pace. I kind of dig it, to be honest. It's nice that they put so much effort into all of these characters' different spider webbing and stuff with each other, but I also really love the anticipation of it. I won't lie to you. It's like waiting for the next book in your favorite series to come out. I want them to take their time and do it justice so it has that emotional impact when it finally does land. So for the time being, Becca won't leave Ryan, and Billy is wanting Becca to leave, but she's not going to do anything about the kid, and he is refusing to really take the kid and really put in any effort at all in lying to Becca. It seems he really does get to be his full self with her and is not accustomed to lying to this person, even though Billy will lie, cheat, kill, steal, literally from any other person. That is not true when it comes to Becca. She's his only exception. And so he's not even really lying to her about it. He's like, let the kid just stay here. They're not going to do anything to him. He'll be fine. And it's just not going to work because that's a little bit too, I don't know, callous isn't the word for it. There's a big difference in this. Billy's just desperate to get Becca back with him. He is elated to have her back, and he's asking her to do something that is antithetical to who she is now as a person. Becca, the mother, is someone whom Billy hasn't met before. And so while they're being reunited, he's also meeting a new Becca. And perhaps she's also meeting a new Billy. But maybe not, considering she already knew that he would try to ditch the child. I'll be thinking about that one for a while. It's been bothering me. But for now, Billy can't have what he wants. He can't be in there with Becca because it's heavily monitored. Becca can't leave because her husband doesn't want her son to come with her. So they are currently at a stalemate, and I don't know what that means for Billy now. Who is Billy without this drive to get Becca? And I think he'll still be driven to get her, just in different ways. But I think a reality in which he finds her and she doesn't want to come with him is not one that he had ever considered, and it's not one that he's prepared for. So I think that him processing this is going to be very interesting. Finally, though, we have the Deep getting married. He seems to have joined the Church of Scientology or something, like the equivalent or allegory for it on this show, and is now getting married. He got therapy, and now he's getting married and trying to rejoin the Seven. So it seems like he's in a good place right now for him. He's on the come up, but really he's in a cult. On the other hand, we have Homelander absolutely losing it. He and Stormfront have a confrontation, and she's not really all that shy about confronting him and being like, yeah, I'm the new face of this. And Homelander was made to be like Captain America. He is the American hero. And so Stormfront just tells him, hey, heroism is kind of antiquated. That's so 2000 and late. And she says that she's essentially the new face of the Seven. And she tells him, you can't win the whole country anymore. No one can do that. You can't have that mass appeal. But you don't need 50 million people to love you. You only need 5 million people to just be absolutely incensed. And then she also says to him, you have fans, I have soldiers. And so we see that perhaps she has a very specific agenda in mind. We don't know exactly what she's going to use these soldiers for, but we do know that she is trying to incite these people to violence. She is trying to bring them over to her side to perform whatever tasks it is that she's wanting to. And it has a very reminiscent tone of Trump being asked to denounce white supremacy during the election debate between him and Joe Biden this year in 2020. And instead, Trump saying that he's telling the Proud Boys to stand down and stand by. It's really the absolute embodiment of American politics today. And she's more like Mr. Edgar in that she's calculated and she can keep her calm in these situations. But Homelander is conversely very emotional. He is absolutely losing it, and he's having an identity crisis because it seems that Mr. Edgar is supporting Stormfront, and Stormfront is actually going to perhaps crush him in these popularity polls, these things that he's dominated for so long without even really putting in that much effort. And now he feels like his whole identity has been taken away. He's had this platform as the head of the Seven really started to be pulled out from under his feet. And him still holding the majority of the popular vote may not really matter ultimately anyway. So he's just gone into full man-child mode and is following Queen Maeve around. So he now knows about Elena too. And he outs her on national television. He absolutely just outs Queen Maeve as being in a relationship with a woman. I don't know if Queen Maeve is bisexual, pansexual, etc., but he just outs her as queer in general on national TV. And then he also is threatening to kill Annie in the elevator. And thank God Annie has learned some lessons in manipulating the truth. Probably some from Huey himself and some from Billy that Huey also picked up along the way. So she just rephrases whatever she's saying so that it's true. And so then she's not lying, and he can't do that human lie detector thing where he watches her pupils for dilating and is measuring her pulse. Plus, she's already super freaked out because he has just tried to blast her through an elevator. So the pulse isn't going to be of much help right then anyway. But she manages to convince him that she is still on Vought's side, at least to the point where he's not going to immediately kill her. But he doesn't necessarily believe that she's all in. He also goes and is starting to push A-Train out of the 7 and is hiring a replacement for him. Because although A-Train had been trying to hide his chest pain and his weakness when they were in the tunnels and such, Homelander did definitely catch him standing there trying to catch his breath with his chest hurting a lot. And remember, if Homelander can hear and feel your pulse and be able to tell what's going on with you, imagine what A-Train's heart racing sounds like. And Homelander's worked with him long enough to know what it sounds like when it is working properly, even while he is going super speedy. So this is definitely something Homelander's picked up on. And that's what this really illustrates, is that he's being very attentive to everything. He's stepping out of the shadows, but you don't know how long that he's been there watching. And he's not going to tell you until he is in a position of power. That's where he's the most comfortable. Ultimately, this episode ends with more of the arc for Homelander. So Doppelganger has been shifting into being Madeline Stillwell in order to fulfill some of Homelander's fantasies. But Doppelganger senses some of the distress in Homelander right now concerning his identity crisis that he's undergoing. He might not necessarily know specifically what all it's about, but he's been spending a lot of time with Homelander in, Madeline Stillwell's skin, more or less. And that is one person that Homelander would confide in before. So he's using this part for therapy, part escape, part sexual release. And he spent a lot of time being pretty open, I suppose, with Doppelganger. So Doppelganger has put some of the pieces together along the way, but then goes ahead and shifts from being Stillwell into being the mirror image of Homelander, although still in the same nightgown. So he offers to get involved in relations with Homelander while Doppelganger is looking like Homelander. But you can see that Homelander is just totally going off of the deep end. We thought he was already there, but ooh boy, I think we're in for a ride. And he's still coming straight off the heels of having that conversation with Stormfront, and he is feeling his world moved out from underneath him. But he's also been processing a lot of what she had said. And he is like, yeah, you don't need 50 million people to love you. You can just make people mad and call that a day. So he says, I don't need everyone to love me. I don't need anyone. And then he strangles himself to death. And by himself, I mean Doppelganger. So now Doppelganger's dead, so he's lost his therapy and mode of escape, but it's also just absolutely, I don't know, it depends on the way you look at it, Freudian, Jungian. He has essentially killed his self and his need for being adored. Homelander was thriving on that before. And that's what he was going out there and doing. That's where he got a lot of his self-worth from, and also his sense of power and superiority. So now he doesn't feel like he even needs to pretend anything at all in order to get people to still be behind him. In order to obtain his goals, he doesn't need people to love him any more than Stormfront needs people to love him. But he's decided he doesn't even need people to be angry. So he's taking this middle path that she's seemingly shown him by showing where she is versus where he was before. And he's decided he doesn't need anyone because he is absolutely a superior being. He's a god in his own eyes. So he doesn't even need adoration anymore. And he doesn't need that old self he had. He's shedding his self like another skin. And I'm really stoked to see what this new Homelander emerges as. By stoked, I also mean I have trepidation and I'm mildly horrified. But character-wise, I am very interested to see how they explore this and to see what Anthony Starr has up his sleeves next. Alright guys, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.